Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a show for users new and old of cryptocurrencies and the king of them all, Bitcoin. Coming up on today's show, U.S. exchange Bitfloor forced shut. Can exchanges even exist in the U.S.? What is FinCEN and why it's the biggest threat to Bitcoin? With Bradley Jansen of freebanking.org. Listener question, why don't people sell Bitcoins for credit cards or PayPal? It's all about perspective when we break down switching from Bitcoins to millibitcoins. Butterfly Labs, a tale of promises broken and the lessons of dealing with volatile currencies. Is mining causing global warming? Andreas takes on Krugman and brings the heat. And finally, correspondent Farzad Hashimi tells us about burying treasure with your mind. Visit us at letstalkbitcoin.com to subscribe for free to our twice-weekly show. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to explain complicated topics in understandable terms. That's really the purpose of what we're doing here, taking the complicated issue of cryptographically secured money and helping people see what it could mean in their own lives. Joining me in our quest for clarity are Andreas M. Antonopoulos and Dr. Stephanie Murphy.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
I'm really excited to be here.
Great opportunity. Thank you, Adam.
Glad to have some assistance in this sort of impossible quest that we've embarked on. So getting right into the news, we are recording this at 11:14 a.m. Pacific time on the 23rd of April, 2013. The top story from where I sit is the recent closure of the U.S. exchange Bitfloor. They released this statement a few days ago. Quote, I am sorry to announce that due to circumstances outside of our control, Bitfloor must cease all trading operations indefinitely. Unfortunately, our U.S. bank account is scheduled to be closed and we can no longer provide the same level of USD deposits and withdrawals as we have in the past. As such, I have made the decision to halt operations and return all funds. Over the next days, we will be working with all clients to ensure that everyone receives their funds. Please be patient as we process your request. And it's signed Roman, who is the president of that company. This is a big deal, not necessarily because of their size, but because this is another U.S. exchange that is being closed for kind of reasons that don't seem to be business related.
And don't seem to be Bitcoin related. Once again, it's all about the friction between, wonderfully flexible Bitcoin and legacy currencies that are really difficult to deal with.
I was really excited about Bitfloor, and I had a bunch of friends who were starting to use it, and people liked it a lot because they were doing, 0.1% a commission on trades, which is insane. You couldn't find that anywhere. And it was relatively easy to get money into it via this Capital One P2P transfer. But I guess it was too good to be true, at least according to the U.S. government, who's got these insane money laundering regulations that have just been really ratcheting up over the last couple of years.
So do we think that there's any space in the United States for an exchange that isn't going to run into these problems, or do we just think that exchanges should stop functionally operating in the U.S.?
Oh, I absolutely think that exchanges can operate in the U.S., and not only are other exchanges operating, CampBX is a good example. One could say Coinbase is another one. New ones are opening at the same time, and we're seeing a couple of new ones being funded, including one that's venture capital backed. I think it's definitely a difficult regulatory environment to work in, but if you do your regulatory homework and persist at it, there's a really excellent opportunity for profit.
So is that what we think then, that just Bitfloor didn't do their regulatory homework and broke some rules that they didn't know about, and so that resulted in this? Because kind of the way that I was reading it, it seemed like Bitfloor was actually one of the more above board. You know, they're operating in New York, which has a lot of very strict anti-money laundering that are even beyond the federal scope. I understand that more exchanges can start up, but what's to say that the thing that stopped Bitfloor won't stop them all?
Nothing much. I mean, the main problem is that these regulations are not very clear and their enforcement is not very consistent. So
Exactly.
I might go as far as using the words arbitrary and capricious.
I think people are really scared, especially those who are sort of more inside the legacy banking system. They're really scared of running afoul of these regulations. And so they just go out of their way, bend over backwards to comply and kind of screw their customers. And I think people who are interested in Bitcoins really maybe don't have some of that fear or don't have that impulse. And they're in Bitcoin because they want to offer people a better alternative to dealing with the legacy banking system. So maybe that's just one of the problems that any Bitcoin exchange would run up against. And as Andreas said, the regulations are so vague that they can essentially be brought down on anyone. So I'm not feeling very optimistic about US-based exchanges, except maybe ones that are even more decentralized and kind of peer-to-peer, like, meeting up with people via local Bitcoins or finding finding some kind of local merchants that people can buy from, so it spreads out the risk over a bunch of people.
Well, maybe there's also two aspects to this. One is doing all your homework in advance, checking all the boxes, making sure you fulfill all the regulations. The other one is actually being prepared for what happens when FinCEN or someone else decides to shine a spotlight on you. And that means having the lawyers to fight this and fight this vigorously in court, so that when they shut down one of your bank accounts, you file temporary injunctions, you appeal the closure, you open other bank accounts, you have your lawyers fighting every step of the way. And this is not one of those things where you prepare and if all goes well, otherwise you just fold. Part of this has to involve a fighting spirit. And, lawsuits in the U.S. are part of doing business, so you should be prepared for them.
I don't think anyone expects the Spanish Inquisition, basically, what's coming down on them. It's millions of dollars to comply with these anti-money laundering statutes. And I know BitInstant is having a hell of a time with that, even though they're making a lot of profit. Some of them just are really hard to predict, and people are starting with very little startup capital, even though there's a great profit opportunity in trading Bitcoins. And I think it's just really difficult to be prepared for it.
I think it's hard for anybody to sink a substantial amount of money into Bitcoin right now if you are a serious player. If you don't have anything to lose, then it doesn't really matter because, worst case scenario, you're going to go back to where you started. But if you're an existing institution and you step into this kind of ambiguous arena, it really seems like it's just dangerous territory.
Well, I think PayPal faced a lot of the same issues when it first started up and had a lot of scrutiny from regulators and managed to persevere in that. Maybe the days of doing that are over and it's a lot harder now. But perhaps professional investors and larger organizations coming into the market can withstand that kind of scrutiny. Perhaps exchanges are not really a game for startups in this space, and you really need to be experienced. And if you only have a small amount of capital and a small starting base, maybe an exchange isn't a good idea.
It is getting harder because these regulations are growing by the minute. I don't know if you guys have heard of these suspicious activity reports, but they're basically like these money laundering kind of reports where if somebody deposits a large amount of cash in a bank account, for instance, or if they try to transfer more than $10,000 either into or out of the U.S., it triggers this suspicious activity report, so-called. And the person may not even know that they have one of these attached to their name, but they're being investigated by the Department of Justice. And there are millions of these filed every single year, and they keep increasing every year. Most people don't even know that's happening. So the regulatory climate definitely is getting bigger. And I also wanted to just mention about PayPal. At what cost to them and to the service that they provide have they complied with these regulations? Because I know a lot of people who have been very dissatisfied with PayPal the way it is now compared to how it used to be. They've been freezing people's accounts. I've had personal experience with that, actually, with the business that I'm part of. They locked down famously WikiLeaks' account. And there have been a lot of kind of high-profile cases of this. So I think PayPal has really become kind of a slave to the existing legacy banking system. They're not that much different than traditional banks. So I think that's something that Bitcoin users may not be willing to do to become sort of part of the establishment.
There's a shocking irony here and something that should concern us all, which is that apparently the regulations don't apply to the largest of financial institutions. They can do pretty much whatever they want, and there's no suspicious activity report when you steal billions or crash the economy. There seems to be a category of too big to fail on one end, and on the other end, there seems to be a category of too small to succeed. And that's really shocking right now because on the one hand, these small companies are being penalized for really activity that has nothing to do with any of these crimes that they're looking for, while the big guys are getting away with theft on a massive scale. It's quite shocking.
This is actually a great lead-in for the interview I did this morning with Bradley Jansen, where basically we talked about and dissected the FinCEN regulations, and he went over a lot of the history, and we touched on a lot of these issues in more detail.
Bradley Jansen. I'm the director of the Center for Financial Privacy and Human Rights. And in a previous life, I was Ron Paul's legislative staffer for banking and monetary issues and edited a newsletter forecasting foreign exchange rates as my first job out of college.
How did that go?
It went well until the recession came in '92 and we all got laid off.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're also the editor of
Freebanking.org, yes. Yeah, it's a group blog of most of the prominent free bankers, Larry White, George Selgin, Steve Horowitz, and others.
What's the elevator speech for how someone would define themselves as a free banking advocate?
They're not fans of central banking.
As the editor of freebanking.org, you've written a few articles recently on the FinCEN guidelines. Can you tell us what FinCEN is and what their function is?
Yeah, FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It's a bureau within the Treasury Department. It's sort of evolved within the Treasury to help them network on financial crimes and then was made an administrative agency under the USA Patriot Act. The reason for having FinCEN is to enforce the anti-money laundering laws from the Bank Secrecy Act. The Bank Secrecy Act was passed in 1970 as part of Nixon's war on drugs. The argument being that money launderers from the drug trade were walking in with duffel bags full of cash and dumping it on the counter and depositing it at the banks. So they argued that if we passed the Bank Secrecy Act, the money would dry up for the drug war and then kids wouldn't have any opportunities to buy drugs on the streets anymore. 40 years later, I'm not sure that argument really carries the same weight that it did then, and we need to go back and re-examine this. There were some other reasons why they argued that they needed to pass the Bank Secrecy Act. Part of that was access to records for tax fraud and cheating on your taxes, though 40 years later we still have a lot of problems with financial fraud and we still have problems with people cheating on their taxes. Another reason that's not much discussed that was argued on the House floor is that in 1970 it was illegal for Americans to own monetary gold. You could still use gold for dentistry and religious and other purposes, but not as a monetary instrument. Some Americans were getting bank accounts in Switzerland where the Swiss franc was tied to gold. The U.S. Treasury argued that because Americans were illegally owning gold, we needed to pass the Bank Secrecy Act to stop them from doing that. Of course, the next year, Nixon closed the gold window, and a few years after that, we progressively re-legalized the ownership of monetary gold and then also the use of gold clause contracts. So those justifications for the Bank Secrecy Act are gone.
So now the name jumps right out at me. When you say Bank Secrecy Act, I'm thinking that it means, that it's enabling banking secrecy, but it sounds like it's actually the opposite of that from what you're telling me.
Right, it actually Anti-Secrecy Act. In fact, there were a couple of Supreme Court decisions because the bankers and their customers and others challenged the Bank Secrecy Act. The cases were consolidated under the California Bankers Association versus Schultz. The California bankers argued that they had a common law obligation to protect the confidentiality of their banking customers' information from third parties. They argued that they had a contractual obligation based on the signing up of accounts and the requirements of sharing information that they had established with their customers. And they argued that there was an explicit expectation of privacy under the California state constitution, that for all of those and other reasons, the Bank Secrecy Act violated their obligation to protect the privacy of their customers. Long story short, because of that decision and U.S. versus Miller, the court basically found that it was premature to argue that we had an expectation of privacy with information we share with a third party, and they punted it back to Congress in the 70s. Congress has never properly picked it up. We're just now sort of dealing with the Pandora's box that they opened up, which is what we call the third-party doctrine, that you have no expectation of privacy with information that could be shared with a third party. So if you write a check and your bank has to then notify the other bank in order to clear the accounts, you can't expect that information will be held private. All of this goes back to the Bank Secrecy Act, and this is the mission of FinCEN. So again, FinCEN's been around in some form or another as it's evolved in order to enforce the Bank Secrecy Act. In the 1990s, we had a big development in cryptography, the sharing of information over the internet, and a lot of technological advances on privacy and encryption and other developments. Out of that primordial ooze developed a crypto banking movement and a lot of other alternatives. PayPal was the most famous example of the alternative currency movement that began then. But the federal regulators came down very hard on PayPal because people had resources in their PayPal accounts, and the feds basically forced them to stop being just a payment system and to become a depository institution, FDIC insured, with all of the other rules and regulations that come with all of the rest of the banks and financial institutions. In addition to that, there was another payment system called eGold that was one of the most successful of the electronic commodity money approaches. And it was FinCEN that shut down the eGold company. They argued that it was in violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, that it was a haven for money launderers and other people that were trying to skirt the law. And because they were in violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, FinCEN had them shut down. What we've seen now is a similar opportunity for new electronic currencies, of which Bitcoin is the most successful. And again, we're seeing FinCEN ramp up their resources and focus their attention on emerging payment systems. The most likely result of this is going to be a repeat of what we saw under PayPal and eGold. Either they're going to force them to change and become depository regulatory institutions and stop being a payment system, or FinCEN's going to set their sights on them as they have with Bitcoin, and we're going to see prosecutions and we're going to see arrests, possibly the death of the emerging payment system.
Do you think that that's what's in the cards for Bitcoin? On the one hand, it seems like FinCEN is really focused on disclosure, and Bitcoin kind of makes it hard to do that. But at the same time, as you said, they forced PayPal to become something that they kind of weren't. Do you think that that was a good thing or a bad thing for PayPal and for its users?
I think the lesson from the 90s was that you either become what FinCEN wants you to be or you're not going to be.
Does that still apply in the case of something decentralized like Bitcoin? Because again, with the eGold comparison, there was a structure there. There was a company that functionally ran that, and so they were able to be targeted. That seems like it's different with Bitcoins. Do you think it's different?
It is clearly different, and FinCEN recognizes it's different, which is why they put out the recent guidance. FinCEN, the other regulators, are all trying to grapple with the new technologies, peer-to-peer networks, and the decentralized payment system developments. I don't know how it's going to unfold, but I do know what the history has been, and I do know that FinCEN hasn't changed on how they approach these issues.
So taking it at face value, based on what they've said so far, what is FinCEN's plan for Bitcoin?
I have heard through the grapevine that FinCEN has prosecutions in the works for Bitcoin, broadly speaking. My guess, based on the timing of the guidance and what I had heard previously through the rumor mill about the prosecutions, is that FinCEN put out the guidance sort of ex post facto in order to justify the prosecutions that they're about to launch.
So you expect this to happen within the next couple of months then, based on that timeline?
Again, I've heard different rumors, so it's difficult to predict. But yeah, we knew that that the prosecutions were in the works, and then later the guidance came out, and it seems sort of a CYA approach to how they're doing it.
What do you think that's going to do to Bitcoin, and do you think that it's going to have a lasting impact, or it's something that's transitory? Or, I mean, we haven't really seen any sort of regulatory action in the space yet, so it seems a little up in the air about the impact.
No, it's a great question. That's the question all of us are asking. I don't know that any of us have a firm answer. There are a lot of different ways this could go. I think it behooves the Bitcoin community to stand up and recognize what the challenge is from FinCEN and to understand that history. And again, a regulatory guidance is meant to clarify issues so that people know what is right and what is wrong so they can stay on the right side of the law. The guidance that they issued here seems, in some respects, to be a muddled mess and raised more questions than it answered. There were also questions that in the guidance, they exceeded their statutory authority by making rules beyond the scope of the intent of Congress. And again, I think there needs to be a dialogue between representatives of the alternative currency movement with the regulators just to work out some of these questions. But as long as they're not talking with each other, we kind of know what to expect based on FinCEN's history.
With that same history in mind, I'm just trying to figure out how they reasonably impact Bitcoin if there isn't any centralized point of contact? Because like you're saying that, the community as a whole needs to interface with the financial regulator, which is functionally what FinCEN is, and to, work with them essentially to put together something that is better than what they would do if they just do something unilaterally by themselves without involving the community.
Or at least have things where they understand what the definitions mean, they understand what the terms mean, they understand what the responsibilities are, and FinCEN would have a better understanding of what their guidance would mean in a practical way in the real world.
So you think that fundamentally they just don't understand the impact of what they're going to do because they don't have enough education on the topic, or they don't have enough experts who have really looked at this problem?
FinCEN has a mission, and they are working to fulfill their mission. And their mission is not to understand Bitcoin. Their mission is to stop financial crimes.
Right. So from that perspective, one of the other things that they really focus on is AML, or anti-money laundering activities. I've been looking at Bitcoin again from that perspective, from the perspective of someone who exists in the current currency paradigm and looks at this thing that has no centralized structure. I mean, doesn't it all look like money laundering? How do you tell what's bad and what's good from a regulatory standpoint?
Bitcoin got a lot of publicity for appealing to people that were trying to get around the law. Silk Road and buying drugs or other illegal paraphernalia. That attracted the attention of the regulators. From FinCEN's perspective, if you're trying to stop financial crimes and this is a tool for financial crime, it is something that warrants their attention.
So do you think that they'll succeed? I mean, do you think it's possible to succeed in this scenario for them?
Again, I've given you their history. They've been the single biggest factor for stomping out currency competition from my perspective.
I guess the thing that I get back to is it seems like if you're going to look at this from a regulatory standpoint, there has to be some entity that can be regulated. And looking at Bitcoin, I don't really see how that works. So are you saying that they'll stomp it out, that they can stomp it out just by saying, this doesn't work, it's illegal, or?
FinCEN was able to stop currency competition with technical innovations in the 90s, even before their expanded powers under the USA Patriot Act. And what we've got now is a FinCEN on steroids without clear restrictions from Congress. And it's a failure of Congress to do its job. We knew that these guidelines and these prosecutions were in the works even last Congress. Ron Paul was the chairman of the House subcommittee that had jurisdiction over FinCEN, and he never had a single hearing on this. Congress has dropped the ball.
Why is that, do you think?
For a lot of people, these are relatively obscure questions.
So you just think it's a general, so many things to worry about that this is low on the totem pole, relatively speaking?
I mean, Congress is a representative body that works to meet the demands of their constituents. Their constituents are demanding a balanced budget or gun control or immigration reform or something else. Those are the issues that you deal with.
So it's just too small of an issue to have been enough cause for concern. And especially in the Congress that we've had for the last 5 or so years, it doesn't seem like too much has been done in general on anything, much less these smaller niche issues.
Well, okay, but you also need to understand, and you look at the gun control as an example. The proponents of the gun control bill were arguing that 90% of the people were in favor of what they were trying to do. But it was a small, dedicated, vocal, energized, and organized community that was able to stop them. And if that doesn't describe what's going on with Bitcoin, I don't know what does.
So you think that the majority in this case would be in favor of this type of financial competition or freedom that we're talking about here, and that it's just a small group of very entrenched interests that have it cannot happen from their perspective. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think you've got it backwards. I think most people don't understand what Bitcoin is, what it does, or why you need an alternative to Federal Reserve notes. But it's not a very important issue to them. It's not something that they're going to organize. It's not something that they're going to withhold political donations about or get active on. On the flip side, those people that are interested and are using Bitcoin and other alternative currencies do have a vested interest in being a vocal, dedicated, organized, and energetic minority on the issue. Unfortunately, they've not been so yet.
So last question. One of the common things that you hear in the Bitcoin community about these recent guidelines issued by the government is that basically it's good news because on the one hand they're acknowledging it and saying, this is something that is legitimate enough to, for us to talk about from a regulatory standpoint. And on the other hand, the impression is that they're treating it like, quote, World of Warcraft gold, which is to say an in-game currency, which is to say not a real currency, which is to say they're not really regulating it. Does that ring true at all for you?
I I think it's very clearly a mixed verdict. On the one hand, regulatory clarity would be a good thing, and the recognition point is well taken. On the other hand, we did not get the regulatory clarity that I think we need from a guidance from FinCEN. So that ambiguity, the possible overreach from the Administrative Procedures Act, and some other issues make the situation more cloudy, and that is going to lead to a lot of confusion, which I think could bring about Bitcoin's demise.
Bitcoin's demise, so you think that it could fail. When we're talking about that, do you mean that the particular currency, Bitcoin, could fail, or are we talking about cryptocurrencies in a broad sense?
Well, I mean, you had used Bitcoin as the example, so I was referencing that. If the perception comes out through law enforcement that anyone who uses Bitcoin and also uses the US dollar and potentially trades Bitcoin for $1 or receives Bitcoin for payment and then pays somebody else in dollars, if they're not working exclusively within a Bitcoin environment, then they're going to fall under certain regulatory procedures and certain regulatory definitions that are going to require prior registration in regular forms and approvals. And if they're not doing that, they're going to go to jail. And if they start arresting all of the people that are using Bitcoin and also using dollars, potentially under confused guidance, yes, we could see the end of Bitcoin.
I know I said that was the last question, but I got a follow-up for you. So the pressure point, the place where it looks like they have all of the leverage in this relationship from a regulatory standpoint, is when people who accept or create, or mine Bitcoins, change them into local currency. In this case, we're talking about US dollars. Does this apply if you don't convert them into US dollars? What happens if somebody just decides to completely exist, in a receiving Bitcoin, sending Bitcoin ecosystem, never touching another currency?
One of the few things that was clear in the guidelines is that if you stay exclusively in a Bitcoin world, you don't have to follow the same registration requirements and reporting requirements to FinCEN. But I assume these people are also required to pay taxes.
Yeah, I mean, that assumption seems to be there, but doesn't there need to be a recognition of it as this is something that I've been trying to do, because I'm involved with a number of Bitcoin businesses that are getting started, and one of the things we keep running up against is how do we value the Bitcoins we receive? Do we use that as a cost basis, and then if we sell them at a higher value at a later point after we receive them, is that a capital gains transaction? And we've been talking to a few lawyers, and nobody really has anything to say about it. Do you think that is going to get cleared up at any point in the near future?
It should have been cleared up in the guidance, but it was not. On the tax side, there are a lot of multinational companies that deal with multiple currencies all the time. US dollar, the euro, Swiss francs, Japanese yen. They file their taxes and all of their other reporting requirements, even in a multi-currency platform. The FinCEN guidance should have, from my perspective, clarified those questions, that Bitcoin valuations for those kinds of reporting should follow the same platform that they do for all other recognized currencies. They did not. So this is one of those examples where the guidance should have clarified a question where they actually made it worse.
Put yourself in the shoes of FinCEN for a second. Everything that's happened to this point has happened to this point. What do you do next about Bitcoin?
I believe that they're continuing their work on current prosecutions.
So we're just talking court cases, so we're going to establish precedents? I mean, is that the goal here? I'm just trying to figure out what the motivation is for these actions. Because it seems like you said, they made the situation less clear, not more clear, when the intention is to make the situation more clear.
Well, their intention is to stop out financial crime. And if criminals are using Bitcoins for crimes, then it's something that they should be going after. I mean, I see a need for the alternative currency people to be working together, and then also liaisoning with FinCEN to address some of these questions and bring more clarity on both sides. If other people see that need, they should send donations to via the freebanking.org site. I'm actually interested in this and trying to help you guys, and I don't see anybody else really stepping up to the plate where the greatest threat to Bitcoin comes.
When you say you guys, who are we talking about?
People interested in alternative currencies. There's a lot of people working on encryption and a lot of the other parts that are important for a successful alternative currency, but the biggest threat is going to come from FinCEN, and I don't see anybody else working on that.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Bradley, to help kind of clarify this obviously very complicated and counterintuitive issue. If you'd like to support Bradley's work, you can visit freebanking.org and donate to them there.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news, it's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Bradley, and I have to say, I've already invited him back if he has anything else that he wants to talk about. You know, talking through these complex issues takes a lot. You have to have a really comprehensive understanding of the issue and then be able to put it into words that the average person can understand. A big part of what makes regulation and legislation in general so hard to understand is the words that they use are often just way too complicated for what they're actually trying to say. And so you wind up with kind of two sets of language, one language that's legal language and one language that's, you know, for everybody else that you can actually understand. That was fun. From the listener mailbag, we had an interesting question. Quote, why hasn't any company taken the risk of allowing users to buy Bitcoin via debit or credit cards? I understand the whole chargeback thing, but I would at least think someone would have tried it by now or come up with a more foolproof way of doing it. Obviously, whoever figures this one out is in line to make some serious cash. What do you think, Andreas? Why hasn't this been tried?
With great rewards comes great risk, and the listener is right in saying that there's some serious cash involved here, but there's also a very serious risk, and it's not just chargeback risk. So if you look at the interface between Bitcoin and national currency, that's where most of the difficulties arise, and it really shines a spotlight on the weaknesses of traditional currency systems and payment systems. So chargeback risk, what is that? Well, if you receive money from PayPal or credit card or any of the other traditional payment systems, you don't actually get the money. What you get is a tentative promise that you will get the money over a period of time. And during that time, the sender can reverse that transaction. That applies to ACH transactions under the NACHA rules. It applies to credit card transactions under the Visa MasterCard rules, and it also applies to wire transfer, surprisingly. So there are lots of ways how a sender can reverse a transaction and basically leave you holding the bag. On the other side, you're giving out Bitcoin. Bitcoin is irreversible and guaranteed. The moment you have 6 confirmations, and honestly, quite a bit before then, because it's difficult to do a double spend even with 0 confirmations, that money's gone. So if you're a merchant taking in uncertain money on one end and giving out certain money on the other end, you're exposing yourself to a lot of risk. Then you've got the possibility of your account being frozen or closed on the US side or the national currency side, as happened to Bitfloor, as we just discussed. And of course, then when you open the window between the initial charge that you take in and the actual payment of Bitcoin, it's about a 7 to 10 business day window. That means you receive the money and you're not guaranteed to hold it for at least 7 days, so you have to wait. During that time, the price of Bitcoin may change dramatically. If you assign the price of Bitcoin based on the first day, you swallow all the risk of the Bitcoin you've purchased. If you don't, you have to purchase Bitcoin in advance and keep stock of Bitcoin. That causes other problems. And generally, it exposes you to a lot of fluctuation. Then your Visa, PayPal, MasterCard, or other merchant account may be closed, and those rules are pretty arbitrary and capricious too. They may decide that what you're doing is against the terms of service, shut you down, and really you have very little recourse to get your account back. A lot of this is really driven by the anti-money laundering regulations we just talked about. And of course, that exposes you to even more risk, because if you're under investigation for any of these anti-money laundering regulations, almost immediately one of the first things that happens is your accounts get frozen, which then leaves you holding enormous liabilities to your customers and a bunch of money you can't touch. And if that's not enough, if you really do become successful at this endeavor, you're going to have a lot of money coming in and a lot of money going out, an enormous volume of cash flowing through your organization. The tiniest hiccup on either the inputs or the outputs will leave you with either a very large amount of money flowing in, or will leave you with a very large deficit because the money isn't flowing in when you need it. So all of these things make it very complex, very risky, from a operational perspective, a legal perspective, and a financial perspective.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective on that, Andreas, because I actually had the same question as why nobody has started doing this yet, but that makes a lot of sense about the just enormous amount of risk involved. It does sound like, just as we were talking about a little bit earlier in the show, somebody would have to be already a pretty large entity with a lot of lawyers on their side to undertake this. And so far, we haven't seen anybody step up who's got the power.
A good example of this is really what we're seeing with some of the existing services that are transacting cash or currency for Bitcoin. Those services are trying to address each one of these risk areas individually. For example, BitInstant, which is one of the organizations used quite a lot, is using money orders and cash transactions through MoneyGram. That reduces their input risk. But they're still having major problems with cash flow and extreme growth, and trying just to handle one of those 5 problems that I mentioned is a full-time job for that company. By the time a company is able to handle all of these problems simultaneously, they've probably grown to quite a big size, and that's not an easy endeavor.
Do you think that we'll reach a point where we can see real financial institutions actually start to enable these transactions? Because it seems like a company like BitInstant, or really almost any of the companies that have popped up over the last couple of years, they're more like stopgaps where they're saying, okay, this is something where the legacy banking system doesn't want to engage with the new banking system, so we'll be the bridge essentially between them. And then every time they get squished, every time they get pushed out of business or pressure is applied, it's because the banking system has decided that they no longer want to deal with this middleman, and they just would rather not have the business at all. I mean, that's what it looks like to me from the outside. Is that an accurate reflection?
Indeed, they are bridges. And eventually, I think regular financial institutions will be joining the game. At the moment, what we're seeing is that all of the on-ramps and off-ramps into and out of the Bitcoin economy represent the steepest areas of difficulty or the largest inefficiencies. But if you're an entrepreneur, you look at inefficiency and you see opportunity. And I think in the end, this is a continuous balance, if you like. People are looking at this and saying, okay, does the reward exceed the risk? Not quite yet, not for me. But at some point, the reward does exceed the risk for a certain type of company, and they jump in and will fill this market. These kinds of inefficiencies can't go on forever without someone taking advantage of them.
I've heard this described before in the context of the prisoner's dilemma, where even if as a whole the banking system doesn't want to engage with Bitcoin because it kind of removes their monopoly on currency, at the same time, there's an enormous incentive for them to buy in early so that as it continues to appreciate, if it succeeds, they'll stand to gain from that too. And it's a sort of thing where the first one that buys in has the lowest price because none of the other banks are in, and then by adding in, they essentially are adding demand without adding to supply. So, I mean, are we just at a point of equilibrium right now where nobody wants to make the first move, and then as soon as some major institution makes the first move, it's going to start a cascade?
I think there's a deeper problem than that, Adam, quite honestly, and that is that you're assuming that financial services institutions have incentives to innovate, and they don't. Financial services institutions have no incentives to innovate, and in fact, a large part of our economy has no incentives to innovate because taking existent money flows, tapping into them and leeching off the profit, or securitizing again and again and again the same stuff and adding more and more leverage is clearly much more profitable than making real things, innovating, or investing in real companies. And that's the main problem in our economy right now. Part of what we're seeing is a reflection of the fact that the banks are making far more money essentially as rent seekers on money streams, and that kills innovation.
Yeah, right on.
Take that, bankers.
With only 21 million Bitcoins in circulation at the point where we stop essentially creating Bitcoins, there's been a lot of talk about what's going to happen to transaction sizes as the value of Bitcoin goes up. One of the checks that's built into the Bitcoin system is the ability for people on an individual basis to change how they look at the Bitcoins that they have and that they receive. So you can look at Bitcoins as Bitcoins, which is the 1.0. You can look at Bitcoins as millibitcoins. You can look at Bitcoin as micro Bitcoins, which are 7 decimals or 5 decimals. Somebody correct me here.
I think it's 6, right? Because millibitcoins would be 3 decimal places, and then microbitcoins would be 6. Both of them are factors of 1,000.
let's go with that. Math is not my strong suit here. So now that we've reached essentially $100 in the Bitcoin value, people are starting to talk and say, okay, well, should we switch the way we look at them to millibitcoins? Because that would then take that one Bitcoin at, $100 or more and essentially take it down to about 1 penny per millibitcoin. So do you guys think it's time for that? Is this premature? Does it even matter if we decide as a comprehensive basis?
I think the market will figure it out, honestly. I mean, everything about Bitcoin is decentralized. And so how to refer to them, how to denominate them is another thing that I think is also going to be decentralized. I mean, even with millibitcoins, people are pronouncing it differently. They're thinking of different names for them. I remember reading a page on the Bitcoin wiki like a couple of years ago, actually, about what the different fractions of Bitcoins should be called. And even then, there were several different proposals. I do think there is sort of a psychological obstacle or psychological thing that comes into play when people think, wow, 1 Bitcoin is worth over $100. If I'm going to donate to somebody, do I really want to give them 1 Bitcoin? That's like more than I want to give, but I don't want to give 0.01 Bitcoins. That seems a little bit stingy. What do I do here? I think that having different denominations would help people kind of overcome that psychological block. Even I've had it before. I mean, wanted to make a donation or pay for something and wanted to have like a nice round number that was over 1. But, I guess that's not the case. And maybe I'm used to just using US dollars. Maybe that's why that comes in. There's the dollar store, right? That's a very popular thing in the US where everything costs $1 or it's in multiples of $1, but not very expensive. And people are happy to do that. But could you imagine a store where everything costs 0.01 Bitcoins? That's a little bit different, right?
So then the question is it better from your perspective to give a donation of 0.01 Bitcoins or 100 millibitcoins? Because that's the same number, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it would be better. I would feel better about it for no rational reason at all, giving a donation of 100 millibitcoins.
I think this goes to the fundamental idea that we're all rational decision makers, which of course we're not. There's a very big psychological factor here, and people who've lived in countries with massively deflating or inflating currencies are used to this concept. Once a coffee costs 100,000 lira, you chop off three zeros off the end, and you turn it into 100 lira, and vice versa. You add zeros if you're having a deflationary situation. What's important is to calibrate the unit of value to people's perception of a small purchase. I personally like the purchasing power parity index that The Economist does on the Big Mac. And what that allows you to do is to calibrate all of the currencies around the world to a common cheap meal that anyone can buy in most countries. I think we should have something very similar for Bitcoin, which is if the unit we're currently displaying it was to be used to buy a Big Mac, the price should be somewhere between 1 and 10 because that makes sense to human beings. If you're trying to encourage smaller transactions, which is really a fantastic capability of Bitcoin, it's very counterintuitive and counterproductive to denominate in Bitcoin because essentially all of the transactions end up being 0.00 something. And that's really difficult for people to calculate. I often find myself pulling out a calculator, and that's no way to do transactions. What you really need is an intuitive correspondence to an everyday tangible experience. I suggest the Big Mac. What that would mean essentially is really moving to millibits. And this is something that will impact transaction volume. It does impact people's perception of what a price is and whether it's expensive or not. And for all of those reasons, this is not just a technical issue. It's absolutely a critical part of economics.
There is the pizza index, right? But that's about $1 million pizza or over, over that much right now. I thought of that when you said the Big Mac index, but I absolutely think you're right. And I'm even wondering if this idea of, people like to have small units that are kind of easy to calculate for small transactions. I'm kind of wondering if that might be part of some of the popularity of Litecoins, because right now Litecoins are worth about $2 and change per Litecoin. And maybe people are more comfortable doing small transactions with them as opposed to Bitcoin.
What is the tipping point for you where it makes sense? You say, okay, Bitcoin is worth $500. Is that the point? What is the magic number where this all makes sense to switch to millibitcoins, kind of just on a general level?
We passed it at about Bitcoin at 10. After that, most of the prices started not making sense for the average day-to-day transaction that most people are comfortable with. So as soon as a cup of coffee costs less than 1 unit in your currency, you've got a problem, and you have to adjust the currency to realign it. We've passed that point.
There may be even another point. Andreas, you said we passed one at 10, but perhaps there's one at 100 as well, like between 10 and 100, and over 100, significantly over 100, it may need to adjust again. Over 1,000, who knows?
I'm a strong proponent of the idea that human perception of currencies is tied to a logarithmic scale. That's why the big psychological barriers to the price were at 10 and 100, and really the next one's going to be at 1,000. So yes, I would totally agree with that. There are several inflection points where you have to continue redividing. And I would suggest, again, the simple rule of thumb. A day-to-day transaction should be somewhere between 1 and 10 of your units of currency. If it isn't, you've got a problem.
It's very interesting how we've placed ourselves on this distribution, because my choice is about 1,000. I think that's the point, where the Bitcoin is worth 1,000 and the millibitcoin is worth $1. I think that's kind of an interesting parity point, because then you can compare the smaller unit to the essentially standard unit of another currency. The fact that we all kind of have these varied opinions on these numbers, and yet are still confining ourselves to that round digit at 10, is telling as to why this is something that should be undertaken on a person-by-person basis instead of everybody all at once.
There's the other cultural experience, which is really that for most Americans, they're used to feeling rich by buying other currencies at multiples for $1, and Bitcoin makes them feel poor.
Right. I mean, that's definitely true, is that Bitcoin turns all of that on its head, and suddenly it's the cleanest shirt.
Yeah, and you feel like you're buying something that's expensive, and that's not a good place for Bitcoin to be. When people start feeling Bitcoin is expensive, again, we've passed that point now.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of people who have been saying to me recently, oh gosh, I would have totally been buying Bitcoins at $8 per Bitcoin. That's totally manageable. But now that they're $100 plus per Bitcoin, I just can't afford them. And it's like, well, you don't have to buy multiples of one Bitcoin. It's not like a stock where you have to buy at least one share. But there's sort of this resistance to understanding that. So I think that is definitely accurate.
Yeah, the flip side of that is if you tell them, well, you can buy 0.1 Bitcoin, now they feel that they haven't bought enough. So the flip side of that is, again, it makes them feel poor. It's either expensive or they can't afford enough.
I heard an interesting interview with Jeffrey Tucker when Bitcoins were on this massive parabolic escalation up to the most recent high of about $260. And he was saying that Americans just are not used to having anything that resembles a deflationary currency, something that gets more valuable the more you hang on to it and has more purchasing power. And as a result of that, it really affects the way you live your life, right? Because if the currency that you primarily use, such as US dollars, is kind of slowly losing its value over time, there's no incentive to save. There's no incentive to hang on to it. You want to buy what you can now before it decreases in value. But if something does appreciate over time and gets more purchasing power, then you really start to evaluate your decisions about whether you want to spend it right now or perhaps get some extra value in the future by hanging on to it. So I just think it's really interesting psychologically.
I love the idea that Bitcoin will actually lead to a solution of our consumerism and obesity problems.
Foxycart.com is a better checkout experience, empowering developers to create flexible, powerful, custom e-commerce in less time, while equipping merchants with the fastest checkout flow available to their customers. Foxycart is built for web professionals. It can serve as a foundation for advanced custom e-commerce deployments or for quick and easy, single-product online stores. And of course, Foxycart supports Bitcoin. Visit Foxycart.com to learn more.
BFL, they showed up at CES and charged $30,000 for a box of fans. That was the tweet. Did you see that the other day?
No, I didn't. That's great. Continuing on what we were just talking about, in a deflationary currency environment, really this leads us straight into BFL, because Butterfly Labs is one of the primary, at least most out there in a public sense, ASIC manufacturers, which is to say the newest and supposedly pinnacle of Bitcoin mining technology. These are application-specific computers that use a very small amount of energy relative to the amount of mining math that they can do in order to generate Bitcoins and process transactions. back in August of 2012, I placed an order in Bitcoin, a pre-order in Bitcoin for a jalapeno, and by the time I finally got my money back for it in January, the number that I was able to get back of Bitcoins had dropped from 24 Bitcoins to 11 Bitcoins, and if I hadn't gotten my money back at that point and was trying to get a refund at this point, I would be getting less than 2 Bitcoins back.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear about that.
It's fine. I got my money back, so the money that I got back in January is now worth, at current exchange rates, like $1,600 or $1,700, what was originally a $149 purchase. So, but that's the point, is that using a deflationary currency, it makes absolutely no sense to try and spend money in advance of when you actually want to use or expect to receive the product.
But if you're a merchant, it makes absolute sense to accept pre-orders so you can then cash the money and make all the money on the way up, if you at least believe it's going to continue deflating.
That's exactly right.
That leads to some very perverse incentives.
I really support the concept of something like BitcoinStarter.com, which is basically Kickstarter but with Bitcoin. But I look at what they're trying to do and I say, have you set yourself up in a way that can possibly succeed? I mean, because people have to make kind of the wrong decision. They have to choose to spend in advance when they don't know what the value will be by the time it is delivered. So you can wind up spending, again, in the case of BFL, if I had sat through it, those 22 Bitcoins, I would have been getting, let's assume they delivered it today, which they still haven't. I'd be getting $150 worth of value for over $3,000 worth of initial investment. And I mean, that's just crazy. How can you as a consumer engage in any kind of thing that could end up like that?
Yeah, and as an entrepreneur, you have the opposite problem. I tried to put up a bounty to get some graphic design work done on Bitcoin Talk, and I offered 10 Bitcoin a couple of months ago. I certainly didn't intend to spend $1,000.
Right.
Wow. So did the bids come in at the end as the price started to go up of Bitcoins?
Well, haven't yet finished the project. It's still going. So it's basically getting more and more expensive by the day, which means I want to get it over and done with quickly, and all of the graphic designers would rather wait a bit.
But does it really even matter?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam, whether or not it matters. I've actually come up against a similar problem myself because I do freelance voiceover work and narrations and stuff. And I would prefer to get paid for my services in coins, but sometimes I have trouble calculating what I should charge because the price fluctuations in Bitcoin are so great. And sometimes from the beginning to the end of a project, it may take quite a while. And the value of Bitcoins in terms of US dollars could be quite different from the beginning to the end. So usually what I end up doing is like kind of loosely tying it to a US dollar rate and saying, look, we can renegotiate this later if the price changes drastically, but it's been kind of a challenge. I'd like to get to a point where it doesn't matter what the US dollar price is, but I'm just not sure exactly, what the value of one Bitcoin is. And I'm not sure that I'm the right person to determine that even. It has to be determined by the crowd, essentially.
Well, fortunately, we're seeing a period of low volatility right now, which has kept the price of Bitcoin relatively stable within a plus or minus 3% range for the last couple of weeks. Now, really, that's the level of volatility that's at most that's acceptable within a currency that you're going to use for day-to-day transactions, or you're going to make promissory notes or make contractual agreements to deliver money later. You need a volatility not exceeding that. So let's hope this is the new normal.
There's also the aspect of Bitcoin that it's a payment network. And so I know there's been a lot of criticism of Bitcoin recently because of the price volatility in terms of US dollars. But even if the price continues to be really volatile, yeah, sure, people will lose money from that and people will profit from that. At the end of the day, Bitcoin is also a payment system, a payment network, and that has value on its own. Even if the price is super volatile, people feel uncomfortable with that, it's still a super valuable way to send and receive payments.
One thing to think about is that we're experiencing this volatility because the vast majority of us move in and out of Bitcoin and back to our national currencies for day-to-day spending. Now, if you look back at the late 80s and early 90s, the dollar was experiencing fluctuations of plus or minus 30%, sometimes plus or minus 40% in a couple of weeks. No one noticed. And the reason they didn't notice, because unless they were going on vacation and had to exchange it for pesos or euros or at the time, lira, they wouldn't really have noticed that because they remained within the economy. If we were remaining within the Bitcoin economy, this would not be an issue at all. It's really, once again, the friction with national currencies on the on-ramps and off-ramps.
On the subject of contracts and making commitments then that you have to follow up on later, one thing that Butterfly Labs did after they blew through their first couple of milestones, because again, the initial release of this product was supposed to be in October of 2012. After they had gone past that initial deadline, what they did is they put up a thing that said if they do not meet the power goals that they were going for, which was a certain wattage per gigahash, then they were going to donate 1,000 Bitcoins to charity. And so now we're 6 months later, the value of Bitcoin is drastically different, and what was, at the time a $4,000 or $5,000 commitment is now over $100,000. What happens now? I mean, by their own standard, they owe this money to charity because they did not hit their power requirements that they were hoping to hit. So what happens? I mean, can we even reasonably hold them to this?
Right. And we know that because there was a video that recently came out from David from Coding in My Sleep, right?
Yeah, David Perry. He's actually going to be doing an interview on the show tomorrow. It's supposed to be for this show, but we got bumped.
Yeah, so David Perry had a video that he put out where he received a advance order of one of the Butterfly Labs products, which I think was a jalapeno mini rig. And it was supposed to have a certain wattage per gigahash, but it did exceed that quite obviously because he put a power meter on it actually to show how much power it was using. I think that Butterfly Labs made this promise publicly, and it's fine to hold them accountable to it. They did put this out there for a reason. It's not a loss for anybody, really, if they give Bitcoins to charity. But, they've also made some other promises publicly, like that they would ship by a certain date, and that kept getting pushed back. So I'm not sure if they have a lot of credibility. I know that there are lots of people who are pretty pissed, frankly, at Butterfly Labs right now.
Well, so the question is, are they going to increase their credibility by fulfilling this promise, or are they going to allow us to repeat the now revised quotation, fool me twice, you're never fooling me again?
Right.
I'd like to talk about the ASIC thing more in detail on probably the next show, because we're running out of time for this one. But it's a complicated topic, and I think it could be a really, really messy sort of rollout over the next couple of months if suddenly all of these ASICs hit all at once and the whole network gets upgraded all at once. I'm very curious what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, me too. I mean, up until pretty recently, there was no even evidence that Butterfly Labs had working prototypes. So it was great to see that little video that David did where the thing was mining. But yeah, again, it wasn't exactly what was promised. It was larger and it was also using more power. Maybe it also speaks to the challenges of actually engineering these ASIC miners and putting products out there. And of course, the saying is real artists ship, right? I get it that they've probably encountered a lot of really unforeseen issues and problems, and they had to kind of tweak their design to get it working. But maybe that's a lesson to other people who are thinking about jumping into the ASIC market, making their own ASICs, that it's going to require a lot of planning and a lot of testing.
Well, like my mother always says, if you can't be a shining example, at least be a horrible warning. And I think the Butterfly Labs so far has definitely fulfilled the horrible warning moniker.
Right.
So one of the things that we've been hearing a lot lately is regarding the energy inputs of these devices. Obviously, this particular device that was tested was consuming more energy than promised. And that matters because if you're a miner, you're looking at the ROI of energy in versus Bitcoin out. And this equation has come under quite a lot of criticism, including by Nobel Prize winner economist Paul Krugman and others regarding the energy consumption of the Bitcoin network. I'm calling BS on that, and quite honestly, I think it's a very shallow argument. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. A lot of the descriptions you hear out there compare the energy consumed in mining with issuing in national currencies. But that's not a fair comparison because mining does a lot more than just mint the coin. It actually ensures the integrity of all of the transactions as well as the integrity of the network against attack, both in the form of injecting transactions that are bogus and in the form of trying to take over the mining pool. So mining is doing a lot more in the Bitcoin economy than just minting. And a more fair comparison would be to compare the energy that goes into Bitcoin mining with the energy that goes into the mint, the paper, the metals for coins, but also the energy that goes into payment networks such as Visa, MasterCard, Discover, Amex, and the dozens of others that exist. The energy that goes into their data centers to do fraud prevention, the energy that goes into the security of their point of sale and merchant systems, and all of the energy that goes into the regulatory frameworks that are built around trust that cannot be guaranteed through computation. So it's really an unfair comparison because if you look at it from that perspective, really the energy per volume of transaction in Bitcoin is cheap.
Why do you think that this is a common argument that we come up against?
I think is really fear, uncertainty, and doubt being spread by people who don't understand the topic. And just like any technology that introduces rapid change, there will be people who are shocked by that change, are worried by that change, and afraid by that change, and grasp at straws to debunk it.
People may believe it because they're not necessarily educated about how the Bitcoin network works, or it's kind of an unseen thing, how much costs actually go into creating the legacy currency system and how much pollution that might create. So maybe education is an issue too. But yeah, I agree with you, Andreas. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
I'd like to maybe make fewer excuses for the journalist discussions, because ignorance may be excused if you're a layperson and you're actually just discussing this in your living room. But if you're writing a story that is putting to question the environmental credibility of a currency that's running transactions, I think a modicum of research and perhaps reaching out some people who know what they're talking about would be in order. And that's a problem to me.
I don't know if you gentlemen were aware of this, but there was a story recently that I found on the Bitcoin Talk forum that there are certain people who have been spokespeople for Bitcoin for quite a while up to this point. And now that there are some people saying they're too radical and they shouldn't be allowed to be listed on these speaker pages for the press. So I think there is even an active kind of effort to suppress certain viewpoints within the Bitcoin community that might be considered too free or too radical.
If we're presenting Bitcoin to the mainstream media, then I think that there's a lot of fear that people will essentially just be laughed off the stage if they have anything that can be tied to them in a negative way. The flip side, though, is that I don't really think that's who spokespeople for Bitcoin are talking to. I think people who want to portray themselves as spokespeople should be talking to people who don't know anything about Bitcoin from the perspective of them not knowing anything about Bitcoin and trying to help them see how it can, have an impact in their own lives. Because, money in general is a really abstract concept. Once you start talking about digital cryptocurrencies, then suddenly the abstractness goes through the roof. It seems like it's a mismatch to me of who we're talking to and how a small group of people are assuming that targeted audience will react.
Right.
At the same time, because Bitcoin is such a decentralized system, there's nothing really stopping anyone who wants to be a spokesperson but doesn't want to engage through this Bitcoin apparatus where there's a list that are a couple of approved sources. So, is there anything stopping anyone from just saying, hey, I would be good at this job, press contact me? What happens then?
There's nothing stopping anyone. And in fact, even for the people who are on the official list, the bigger issue is there's nothing stopping anyone from taking Bitcoin and projecting all of their own political opinions, desires, and expectations onto a currency that's relatively neutral. Taking that and then trying to show how Bitcoin is going to bring on this new world of XYZ, whatever their expectation is. I think that's the flip side of that argument and the danger, which is that really people see Bitcoin the way they want to see Bitcoin.
So if you think that you would be a good spokesperson for Bitcoin, you should definitely email us. Right now, the email is still adam@mindtomatter.org. So that's about all the time we have for this episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. I'd like to thank my co-hosts, both Dr. Stephanie Murphy and Mr. Andreas M. Antonopoulos, for joining me for today's episode.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. This was really fun.
It was indeed a lot of fun. We're going to leave you today with an interview with a correspondent named Farzad. We were originally going to talk about money transfers, but it kind of wound up being about brain wallets and buried treasures. We will see you on the next episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. You can visit us and subscribe at letstalkbitcoin.com. Enjoy.
My name is Farzad Hashemi, and I'm a cryptocurrencies design and integration strategies consultant. What I like is people themselves need to step a little back, take this as an example, and see that they already have problems in their lives that Bitcoin can solve. They just don't know how this solution applies.
So what problems of yours did it fix, and how did you apply them to your life?
To be honest with you, none. I didn't have much problems. Well, gifts. It's a very nice and sexy way to give gifts. I just give a postcard to someone and the message itself is a brain wallet. I really like doing that. It has tremendous reception. People love it. I just give them a postcard for a birthday or a particular occasion, the wedding gift. And then later on tell them, by the way, like the day after, the message in that, you could enter it in blockchain, the info, and get a bunch of Bitcoin. And they just love it. They go ecstatic. It's like nothing else. It's just the message. It's a piece of text. For the first time in history, you can put literal value in information, in just that piece of information. Brain wallets fascinate me. I think there is tremendous applications for them.
So you're talking about sending physical mail that has a brain wallet, essentially, phrase written on it, and then anybody, even if they're not connected to the same internet you are, they can still retrieve that.
Absolute liquidity. Just words. You can whisper to someone even before choosing to put the money, before having the money in the brain wallet. Tell them 1 p.m., 1 Bitcoin in this phrase, and it's done. You can put the Bitcoin there later. You have had your transaction. You see what just happened? I mean, if there's a minimal amount of trust between two people that this person is going to pay me later on that date, it's done. You see how that went?
Are you familiar with a project called Open Transactions?
Vaguely, yeah.
From what you're telling me, it sounds like you're using brain wallets in the same way that basically hiding something in plain sight, where it's not like there's any great locking mechanism on it so much as it is that you and whoever you share the information with are the only people who have that information. So what Open Transactions functionally does is it says, okay, we can't hide anything because we want complete transparency. Think of a giant grid with, a million squares in any direction. And in order to look in a particular grid, you have to know the coordinates of that grid. And so all you do then is just take whatever it is you want to leave, if it's a couple of Bitcoins or whatever, and you place it on one specific point on that grid, and then only someone who specifically looks there can access it, and the grid is so large it's impossible for any person to do that in a reasonable amount of time. It's like you're burying treasure almost with your mind.
Exactly. Now imagine if that treasure itself is something that requires thinking. It's the answer to a riddle. No, I just keep trying to come up with ways of doing that. There are limitations because of the password needs to be exact. You need to have some ground rules.
Thanks for tuning in to the pilot episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Whether you liked or hated the show, we want to know what you think. Please send all comments, listener questions, and critique to adam@mindtomatter.org. Stay tuned for our next episode coming Saturday, the 27th of April, featuring an interview with David Perry, the only man in the universe to have received an ASIC product from Butterfly Labs. Or maybe not. But he's been mining with it for a week now, and I've got some questions for him, so stay tuned.